The
You think
morning
you can
sun
just
beat
walk
down
here?
without mercy as Piper
Yeah!
Calloway adjusted the heavy jacket on her narrow shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of stares from her classmates gathered near the school's chain-link fence. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and the whispers had not stopped. They never stopped in a town like Redstone Gap, where gossip traveled faster than the desert wind and clung longer than the dust that coated everything. "Look, there goes Graveyard Girl," Madison Cooper called out, her voice carrying that special cruelty only 12-year-olds could perfect. Still wearing her dead grandpa's gross jacket, Piper kept walking, her worn sneakers crunching against the gravel path that led from the bus drop to the main building. The leather jacket hung past her knees, its sleeves rolled up so many times they resembled bulky donuts around her thin wrists. She had tried leaving it at home once, just once, on a morning when the desert heat made the leather feel like a portable oven strapped to her back. But her mother had caught her at the door and sent her right back to the bedroom. "It's the only decent thing he ever gave this family," Jolene Calloway had said, her voice sharp with old pain that never seemed to dull. "You'll wear it and be grateful." Grateful. Piper pressed her lips together, tasting dust and disappointment as she crossed the schoolyard. She was grateful, all right. Grateful for the way Tommy Martinez held his nose when she passed, as though the jacket carried the stench of the grave itself. Grateful for how even the teachers looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and irritation that meant problem child. The kind of girl who would never quite fit into the neat rows and predictable outcomes they had been trained to manage. Most of all, she was grateful for the patch on the back of the jacket, the patch that made everyone treat her like she carried some kind of disease. It sat between her shoulder blades, stitched into the leather with the kind of precision that spoke of craftsmanship rather than factory production. A silver serpent coiled around a flaming wheel, its details faded to the color of old pewter, its edges frayed and mysterious against the cracked black leather. Piper had spent hours tracing its outline with her finger late at night on the sagging couch that served as her bed, wondering what it meant, why her grandfather had worn it with such quiet reverence, and why her mother's face went stone cold whenever Piper asked about it. "Piper, honey, wait up." Mrs. Pritchard's voice cut through the morning heat like a blade through butter. The elderly woman from Trailer 47 hurried across the dusty lot that separated the school from the mobile home park, her house slippers kicking up small clouds of red earth with each shuffling step. She reached Piper just as the first bell rang. Her weathered face creased with the kind of concern that went deeper than neighborly politeness. "How you holding up, sweetheart?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes lingered on the jacket, and Piper caught something in her expression she could not quite identify. Not pity, not disgust, something older, something that carried weight. "That's quite a distinctive piece your grandfather left you." "It's just a jacket," Piper mumbled, shifting her backpack higher on her shoulder. But Mrs. Pritchard was already stepping back, her expression shifting from warmth to something that looked almost like fear. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a cloud pass across the sun. "Yes, well," the older woman glanced around nervously, scanning the school parking lot and the stretch of road beyond, as though expecting something to emerge from the shimmering heat. "Just be careful who sees you wearing that, dear. Some symbols carry more weight than others, more weight than a child ought to bear." Before Piper could ask what she meant, Mrs. Pritchard scurried back toward the trailer park with a speed that seemed impossible for a woman her age, leaving Piper standing alone as the last stragglers rushed toward the school building. The morning felt different after that, heavier, like the air itself had thickened with something she could sense but not name. The day crawled by with the particular cruelty that small-town schools reserve for children who exist outside the invisible lines of social acceptability. Arithmetic problems blurred together on the chalkboard, geography lessons described places Piper knew she would never see, and the industrial clock above Mrs. Garcia's desk ticked with the deliberate slowness of time measured in disappointment. During lunch, Piper sat alone at the corner table near the emergency exit, picking at her free meal tray, while the other kids clustered in their perfect little groups. She had grown accustomed to the isolation over 3 weeks of wearing the jacket. Before her grandfather died, she had been merely invisible. Now she was something worse. She was visible in the wrong way, a curiosity, a target, a girl defined entirely by a dead man's wardrobe. Through the cafeteria windows, the desert stretched endlessly toward the mountains, heat waves making the distant peaks shimmer and dance like a mirage painted by a drunk artist. Redstone Gap was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere that mattered. The kind of place where the gas station attendant knew your name, your business, and your grandmother's maiden name, and where the only restaurant had been serving the same 6 items since before Piper was born. Her mother always said they were saving money to leave, but the glass jar hidden behind the cereal boxes in the kitchen cabinet never seemed to get any fuller, and the highway out of town remained as distant as the mountains themselves. Hey, freak show. Bryce Lowell slid into the seat across from her with the casual menace of a boy who had learned early that size was its own kind of authority. At 13, held back twice and towering over everyone in the 6th grade, he had carved out a kingdom built on fear and the complete absence of adult consequences. His cronies flanked him like backup singers in a show nobody had asked to see. My dad says your grandpa was crazy. Bryce leaned forward, close enough that Piper could smell the cheese from his pizza and the faint chemical scent of whatever his mother used to wash his clothes. Says he used to disappear for months at a time, then come back all beat up and bloody like some kind of animal. Piper's grip tightened on her plastic fork. Your dad doesn't know anything. He knows your grandpa was in some kind of gang. Bryce's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper performing for the tables nearby that had started to lean in, drawn by the promise of drama. Says that jacket probably has blood on it, dead man's blood. Bet if they put it under one of those black lights, the whole thing would glow red. The other kids at neighboring tables had stopped pretending not to listen. Piper felt heat rising in her cheeks, climbing up her neck like a living thing. But it was not embarrassment. It was anger, pure, sharp, and clean as broken glass. At least my grandpa wasn't a drunk who can't keep a job past Tuesday, she said quietly. Bryce's face darkened like a storm rolling across the desert. He reached across the table and grabbed the collar of her jacket, his thick fingers twisting the leather as he jerked her halfway across the surface. Piper's tray clattered to the floor, milk carton exploding in a white splash across the linoleum. What did you say, you little Mr. Lowell? Mrs. Garcia's voice cracked like a whip from across the cafeteria. Release Miss Calloway immediately and report to the principal's office. Now. Bryce let go with a shove that sent Piper tumbling back into her chair hard enough to push the metal legs 6 inches across the floor with a screech. He stalked away, muttering threats that carried the conviction of a boy who had never once faced a consequence that stuck. Piper smoothed down the jacket with trembling hands and tried to ignore the stares from every direction. They burned hotter than the desert sun, and unlike the sun, they would not set at the end of the day. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of chalk dust and flickering fluorescent lights. When the final bell rang, Piper gathered her belongings and headed for the door, eager to escape into the desert heat, where at least the silence was honest and the sky did not judge. But as she stepped through the main entrance, a distant rumble reached her ears, deep, rhythmic, and growing louder with each passing second. The unmistakable sound of motorcycles approaching from the east, where the highway cut through the mountains like a scar across the landscape. She paused at the edge of the school parking lot, shading her eyes against the sun. The rumble grew and swelled, filling the air with a presence that seemed to push against her chest. Then the sound faded, swallowed by distance and the desert's vast indifference. Whatever machines were making, that thunder remained hidden beyond the shimmering horizon. But something stirred in Piper's chest. A restless feeling, nameless and electric, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the wind push you forward. The walk home took 15 minutes through streets that existed more in hope than in fact. Redstone Gap had been planned as a mining town back when people believed the Nevada desert would give up its riches willingly. Now it was mostly trailer parks connected by cracked asphalt and stubborn weeds, a collection of faded dreams held together by inertia, and the simple truth that leaving required money nobody had. Piper's trailer sat at the end of Sagebrush Lane, a faded blue single-wide with aluminum siding that rattled in the wind like the skeleton of something that had once been alive. The tiny yard was mostly dirt marked by her mother's failed attempts at desert gardening, a few scraggly cacti and some sun-bleached lawn ornaments that had come with the place remnants of whoever had lived here before and decided even this was not worth keeping. She found Jolene exactly where she expected, hunched over the kitchen table with a calculator, a manila folder full of bills, and an expression that could curdle milk at 50 paces. At 32, her mother looked older. worn thin by disappointment in the kind of poverty that gnaws at everything, the walls, the furniture, the spirit, until nothing remains but the bare minimum of survival. "How was school?" Jolene asked without looking up, her pencil scratching across a piece of paper covered in numbers that never added up to enough. "Fine." Piper dropped her backpack by the door and opened the refrigerator, finding the usual contents. A half-empty jar of peanut butter, some wilted lettuce past the point of revival, and a carton of milk that would expire tomorrow. She pulled out the milk and drank directly from the carton. "Use a glass, Piper. We're not animals." Jolene's pencil paused for a fraction of a second. "Use a glass." Piper ignored her and settled onto the sagging couch. The living room was cramped but clean, decorated with furniture that carried the particular sadness of things acquired from garage sales and classified ads. Cushions that did not match a coffee table with a water ring the size of a dinner plate, curtains that had been yellow once upon a time and were now the color of old teeth. The only photograph visible was a small wedding picture of her parents taken before Piper was born, before her father decided that family life lacked the excitement he craved and disappeared into the wind like smoke from a match that had burned too fast. "Bryce Lowell grabbed my jacket today," Piper said, testing the waters. Jolene's pencil stopped moving. "What did you do?" "Nothing. Mrs. Garcia sent him to the principal's office." "Good." The pencil resumed its scratching. "That Lowell boy's trouble, just like his father. You stay away from him." Piper studied her mother's profile, noting the tight lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders curved inward, as though bracing against blows that had already fallen years ago. She had been building toward this question all day, ever since Mrs. Pritchard's strange warning, ever since Bryce's taunts about blood and disappearing. "Mom, what did Grandpa Emmett really do before he moved here?" The pencil snapped, a clean break right through the middle, the two halves rolling in opposite directions across the table. Jolene stared down at the pieces for a long moment before speaking, and when she did, her voice carried the flat, careful tone of someone reciting a script they had rehearsed until the words lost all meaning. "Your grandfather was a complicated man, Piper. He made choices, difficult choices. That's all you need to know." "But the patch on the jacket," Mrs. Pritchard said, "it's just an old design from some motorcycle club." Jolene's voice carried a warning now sharp as a knife's edge. "Probably bought it at a thrift store or won it in a card game. Stop asking about things that don't matter anymore. He's gone. We're here, end of story." But it was not the end. Piper could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the fear that flickered across Mrs. Pritchard's eyes, in the stories Bryce's father told over beer and bitterness. The jacket felt like a question she could not answer, a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the picture on the box torn beyond recognition. Her mother returned to the bills, pulling a fresh pencil from the kitchen drawer, with the weary efficiency of a woman who had been breaking pencils over numbers for years. Piper waited until she was fully absorbed, then slipped off the couch and moved quietly toward the back of the trailer, past the narrow hallway, where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing about whose turn it was to empty the septic tank. She knew about the box. She had seen it once, a few days after the funeral, when Jolene had been rummaging under the trailer's crawl space looking for a pipe wrench. A metal lockbox, dented and dusty, shoved behind a pile of old tires and broken lawn furniture. Her mother had pulled it out, stared at it for a long time, then shoved it right back without opening it. As though the box itself was dangerous. As though just touching it might set something in motion that could not be stopped. Piper eased open the back door, letting the desert heat wash over her as she crouched down beside the trailer's skirting. The crawl space smelled of dust and engine oil and the particular staleness of enclosed desert air. She reached past the tires, past the broken remnants of a folding chair, until her fingers found the metal edge of the lockbox. It was not locked. The latch had rusted into a permanent open position, and the lid swung up with a groan of protest that sounded almost human. Inside, Piper found what she had been looking for and more. Things that dismantled her mother's story, one piece at a time. 3 photographs, their edges curled and yellowed. The first showed a young man she recognized as her grandfather, not from the frail figure she remembered from his final years, but from the jawline and the set of his eyes. He was young in this picture, maybe 30, and he stood beside a gleaming motorcycle with his arm around another man's shoulders. Both wore leather jackets covered in patches. Both grinned at the camera with the reckless confidence of men who believed they were immortal. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in neat block letters, Emmett and Silas, Boneyard Run, 1988. The second photograph showed a larger group, maybe 15 men and women, standing in front of what looked like an old mining camp. Their motorcycles were lined up behind them in a formation that spoke of discipline rather than recreation. In the center of the group, a woman with braided gray hair held a banner that read, Dust Devils MC, in letters that matched the style of the patch on Piper's jacket. The third photograph made Piper's breath catch. It showed her grandfather in his jacket, the same jacket she wore now, and the patch on his back was clearly visible. Not faded, not frayed. Sharp and new and unmistakable, the silver serpent coiled around its flaming wheel, broadcasting something that Piper was beginning to understand was never meant to be decorative. Beneath the photographs lay a small business card, soft with age, its corners rounded from years of being handled. The card read, Harlon Puit, Branch Manager, First National Bank of Redstone Gap. Below the printed text, someone had handwritten a number in pencil. Box 247. Piper stared at the card for a long time, feeling the pieces of something vast and hidden beginning to shift beneath her feet. Her mother had lied. The patch was not from a thrift store. Her grandfather had not been a simple man who made complicated choices. He had been something specific, something that carried enough weight to make old women nervous and young boys cruel, and her own mother's voice go flat with fear. She pocketed the card, replaced the lockbox, and made her way to the flat rock behind the trailer, where she could see the entire valley spread out below. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the highway that connected Redstone Gap to the rest of the world. From here on clear days, she could see the heat shimmer over the mountains and imagine that the whole landscape was breathing alive with secrets it would only tell to those patient enough to listen. The sun was descending toward the peaks when Piper made her decision. Tomorrow she would find Harlon Puit and his bank card in his box, 247. Tomorrow she would start asking the kind of questions her mother refused to answer. She did not have to wait until tomorrow. The next morning, Piper skipped the bus and walked the extra 20 minutes to Main Street, where the remnants of Redstone Gap's commercial ambitions lined both sides of a road that seemed wider than it needed to be, as though the town had been built expecting traffic that never arrived. Most of the storefronts were empty, their windows covered in newspaper or plywood, but a few stubborn businesses remained. A hardware store that also sold fishing bait, a laundromat that doubled as a notary public, and at the far end of the street, a small repair shop with a hand-painted sign that read Pruitt's Fix-It above a doorway cluttered with everything from broken toasters to vintage radios. Piper pushed through the door, a bell announcing her arrival to an interior that smelled of solder and old wood and the particular musk of a man who had spent decades surrounded by broken things. Harlon Puit stood behind a workbench cluttered with the disassembled guts of what might have been a washing machine, his silver hair combed neatly to one side, his hands stained with motor oil that had become as permanent as tattoo ink. He looked up at the sound of the bell, and his face registered the polite neutrality of a shopkeeper preparing to explain to a child that he did not sell candy. Then his eyes found the jacket, traveled down to the sleeves rolled into their bulky donuts around her thin arms, tracked across the worn leather to the collar, and then inevitably to the place between her shoulder blades where the patch sat like a declaration written in silver thread. Harlon Puit's face went white, not gradually, not like a man receiving unexpected news, but instantaneously as though someone had pulled a plug and drained every drop of color from his skin in a single heartbeat. Where did you get that? His voice came out wrong, too tight, too careful, the voice of a man trying very hard not to shout. It was my grandfather's, Emmett Calloway. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Harlan's hands, which had been steady enough to solder circuit boards and splice wiring for decades, began to tremble. He set down the screwdriver he had been holding with the deliberate care of someone who did not trust himself not to drop it. You shouldn't be wearing that. His eyes darted to the windows, scanning the empty street beyond with the same nervous energy Mrs. Pritchard had shown. You shouldn't be wearing that where people can see it. Why not? Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it. The internal struggle played out across his features like a movie projected on a screen too small for the picture. He wanted to tell her something. The desire was so obvious, it was almost painful to watch. But something held him back. Fear, loyalty, a promise made to a dead man. Piper could not tell. Go home, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Take that jacket off and put it somewhere nobody will find it. And don't come back here. Don't ask questions that'll bring trouble down on both our heads. He turned away, picking up his screwdriver with hands that still shook, and began working on the washing machine's innards with a concentration that was transparently false. The conversation was over. The door had been slammed in Piper's face, but she had seen enough. The card in her pocket box 247, the terror in an old man's eyes. Whatever her grandfather had left behind in that bank, it was real enough to make a grown man's hands shake. Real enough to be worth hiding for over a decade. She left the shop without another word, but she filed Harlon Puit's name and face in a place where she would not forget them. Someday soon she would need him. She was certain of that now, with the same bone-deep certainty that told her the desert sun would rise tomorrow. The rest of that morning passed in the kind of distracted haze that teachers interpret as disrespect and classmates interpret as weakness. Piper moved through her classes like a ghost, her mind circling the same questions over and over. The photographs, the patch, the box, the way everyone seemed to know something about her grandfather that they were terrified to share. She was walking home from school that afternoon, taking the long way through the back streets to avoid Bryce and his friends, when the sounds she had been hearing in her dreams finally became real. Not distant thunder this time, not the fading echo of engines beyond the horizon. This was close, immediate, a rolling wall of sound that started as a vibration in her chest and grew until it shook the very air around her. 23 motorcycles crested the hill at the edge of town, their chrome catching the afternoon sun like a river of light flowing downhill. They rode in formation, disciplined and purposeful, nothing like the weekend riders who occasionally passed through Redstone Gap on their way to Vegas with their brand new leathers and their polished boots that had never touched anything rougher than a parking lot. These riders were different. Their bikes bore the marks of serious mileage. Their jackets were worn and patched and broken in by years of wind and weather and roads that did not appear on any map a tourist would carry. They moved as a single unit, the lead bike setting a pace that the others matched without hesitation or variation, the way a flock of birds turns in unison, guided by instinct rather than command. The lead bike was larger than the rest, a machine that seemed to have been built for a man of considerable size, its engine producing a bass note that made the ground itself vibrate beneath Piper's sneakers. The rider was broad-shouldered, his gray hair visible beneath a helmet that had seen decades of use, and even from a distance, he commanded the kind of attention that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with presence. Piper watched them slow as they entered the town limits, their engines downshifting in a synchronized rumble that brought people to their porches and their windows. Screen doors slammed up and down Main Street as Redstone Gap's residents emerged to witness something that most of them had never seen, and all of them understood instinctively was significant. These were not tourists. These were not passing through. The motorcycles arranged themselves in a line along Main Street with the precision of a military unit falling into formation. Engines died one by one, leaving a silence that felt more charged than the noise that preceded it. The riders dismounted in unison, removed their helmets, and stood beside their machines, like sentinels posted at the border of a territory they intended to claim. Piper stood frozen at the corner of Sagebrush Lane, watching the gray-haired man at the head of the formation scan the town with deliberate intent. His gaze swept across the storefronts, the trailer parks, the scattered houses, and empty lots that made up the dying bones of Redstone Gap. When his eyes reached the edge of the residential area where Piper stood, she felt something she had never experienced before. Not the sting of being noticed. Something deeper, the sense of being recognized. She turned and ran, not from fear exactly, but from the overwhelming pressure of a moment she was not ready to face. Her sneakers kicked up dust as she sprinted down Sagebrush Lane, burst through the screen door, and found her mother already on her feet listening. The sound of the motorcycles had been impossible to ignore, even inside the trailer's thin walls. "Mom, there's a motorcycle club coming into town. A big one. Over 20 bikes." Jolene's face went white. The same instantaneous drain of color Piper had seen on Harlon Puit's face, but magnified by something personal. Something that went beyond fear into the territory of old wounds ripped open without warning. "How many?" Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. 20, maybe more. They're on Main Street right now." Jolene moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out with one eye the way a person checks for intruders rather than visitors. Her hands trembled against the fabric. "Take off the jacket." The words came out flat and hard. "Take it off now, hide it." But why? Jolene spun around and Piper had never seen such naked terror in her mother's eyes. Not when the bill collectors called, not when the fire broke down on the highway at midnight, not even when they had buried Grandpa Emmett in the cheapest casket the funeral home offered, watching the dirt fall on someone who had once been the center of their tiny universe. They cannot see you wearing it, Piper. They cannot see that patch. Do you understand me? If they see it, everything changes. Everything. Then tell me why. Piper was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Tell me what Grandpa really was. Tell me why everyone in this town is so scared of a jacket. There's no time. There's never time, Mom. There's never time, and there's never money, and there's never answers. So just this once, tell me the truth. Jolene's shoulders caved. She sank into a kitchen chair, and for a moment she looked like what she was. A 32-year-old woman who had been carrying the weight of someone else's secrets for so long that they had become indistinguishable from her own bones. Your grandfather was a violent man, Piper. He lived by codes that had nothing to do with right and wrong, men who answered to no law except their own, blood debts, oaths that bound a person tighter than any chain. Her mother's voice cracked. He tried to leave it behind when you were born, thought he could disappear, start over. But the past doesn't let go. Not in the desert, not ever. A knock at the door, not loud, not aggressive, but carrying the unmistakable weight of someone who had traveled a very long distance and was not leaving until he got what he came for. Piper looked at her mother, at the trailer that contained everything they owned, at the $23 in the emergency jar, and the broken Honda in the driveway, and the desert stretching endlessly in every direction, offering no escape to people who could not afford the money to reach the horizon. If I don't open this door, Piper said quietly, will the debt just disappear? Will they leave us alone forever? Her mother's silence was the loudest answer she had ever received. Piper opened the door. The man standing on their doorstep was larger than he had appeared from a distance, his presence filling the narrow space between the trailer and the world outside like a force of nature given human form. Up close, she could see the intricate details of his jacket patches that told stories and symbols she could not read, colors that spoke of years spent in a world that existed parallel to the one she knew but operated by entirely different rules. His eyes were pale blue, startling against his weathered skin, and they held a mixture of sorrow and recognition that made Piper's chest tighten with something she could not name. He looked at her the way people look at photographs of the dead, with tenderness, with grief, with the particular pain of seeing someone you love reflected in someone you have never met. Emmett's granddaughter, and he said, and his voice carried the deep roughness of a man who had spent decades breathing engine exhaust and desert wind. You have his eyes, exactly his eyes. Piper lifted her chin. You knew my grandfather. Knew him. The man's mouth curved in something that existed in the space between a smile and a wound. Girl, I rode with Emmett Calloway for 15 years. Watched him save my life more times than I can count, and probably saved his just as often. He was my brother in every way that mattered. Behind Piper, her mother made a small, broken sound, a single syllable that contained more history than any book Piper had ever read. Silas! The man's attention shifted. His expression softened slightly, the way stone softens when water has been running over it for a very long time. Jolene, you look well. No thanks to you or your kind. The bitterness in her mother's voice could have stripped paint from steel. We buried all of this with him. We agreed it was supposed to be over. He made promises before he made agreements with you. Silas Kane's voice remained gentle, but underneath the gentleness lay a foundation of absolute steel. Oaths that don't die just because the man who swore them does. His pale eyes returned to Piper. May I come in? This isn't a conversation for doorsteps. Piper stepped aside before her mother could protest. Silas scanned their living room the way a man reads a battlefield, taking in the thrift store furniture and the scattered bills and the small wedding photograph, and all the tiny indicators of a life lived at the margin of survival. If he judged their poverty, His weathered face betrayed nothing. "You're wondering why we're here," he said, settling his considerable frame onto the edge of the couch with the care of someone who understood that not all furniture was built to support a man of his dimensions. "Why now? After all these years?" "My grandfather's been dead for 3 weeks." Piper remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "But the jacket hasn't been worn in 12." Silas leaned forward, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that made the air between them feel electric. "That patch you're carrying, it's not decoration, girl. It's identification. It broadcasts who you are to anyone who knows how to look. Like a frequency that only certain radios can pick up. And today, for the first time since your grandfather went into hiding, someone was looking." The words settled into Piper's understanding like stones sinking to the bottom of a clear pool. "What do you mean someone was looking?" "Rival clubs have long memories. Old grudges don't fade just because the original players disappear." Silas's voice dropped lower, the way a man's voice drops when delivering news that changes everything. "Word reached us this morning that the Sidewinders are riding north from Phoenix. They'll be across the Nevada border by tomorrow night, and they're asking questions about Emmett Calloway's family. About his bloodline." Jolene made that broken sound again, and this time she sank into a kitchen chair as if gravity had suddenly tripled, and her legs could no longer bear the weight of standing in a world where this was happening. "They said they'd forgotten." Her mother's whisper was the sound of hope dying. "They said the debt died with him." They lied. Silas delivered the truth without softening it, because some truths cannot be softened without becoming lies themselves. "The Sidewinders don't forget, and they don't forgive. Emmett cost them something precious 20 years ago, and they've been waiting for the right moment to collect payment. Your daughter putting on that jacket in public was a signal flare in a dark room." "What did he cost them?" Piper's voice held steady while everything inside her trembled. She needed the answer the way a drowning person needs air. Not because it would save Ahadayever, but because she could not die without knowing. Silas studied her face for a long moment, his pale eyes measuring something in her that she did not know she possessed. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy a question he had been carrying for years. He chose family over brotherhood, broke sacred oaths to protect people he loved. His eyes moved meaningfully toward Jolene. Some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed, and the men he crossed have been sharpening their knives ever since. The trailer felt smaller, the walls pressed inward. The desert outside seemed to expand in every direction, making their home feel like a speck of dust in an ocean of sand and heat and old violence. "So what happens now?" Piper asked. Silas stood, and the trailer seemed to shrink further around his presence. "Now you choose. You can run. Take off that jacket, disappear into whatever anonymity you can find, and hope they never track you down." He paused, and his pale eyes held hers with the gravity of a man who understood that what he was about to say would change a child's life forever. "Or you can come with me tonight, learn what that patch really means. Understand the power your grandfather died protecting." "Piper, no." Jolene was on her feet, tears streaming down her face. "You can't ask her this. She's 12 years old." "Piper," Silas corrected gently. "And I'm not asking. I'm offering. The Sidewinders will be here regardless of what she decides. The only question is whether she faces them with knowledge or ignorance." Piper looked at her mother, at the tears, at the terror, at 32 years of running from something that had finally caught up. She thought of their broken car and their empty jar and the highway that led everywhere they could not afford to go. "If I stay," Piper said slowly, "they come anyway, and we have nothing." Jolene's sob confirmed what Piper already understood. There was no safe choice. There was only the choice that came with understanding and the choice that came without it. "I'll go." She gathered what she needed in less than 3 minutes. A change of clothes in her backpack, the business card from Harlon Puit's shop, her grandfather's photographs from the lockbox, and the jacket still heavy on her shoulders, still broadcasting its signal to anyone who knew how to listen. Her mother stood in the kitchen doorway, arms wrapped around herself, watching her only child prepare to walk into a world that had already consumed one generation of their family. "He tried to protect you from this," Jolene whispered. "Everything he did, leaving the club, hiding, dying alone in that trailer. It was all to keep you safe." "I know, Mom." Piper paused at the door. "But safe didn't work. They found us anyway." The desert air hit her face as she stepped outside, carrying the scent of sage and cooling asphalt, and underneath it all, the faint trace of motor oil that seemed to follow the dust devils like a signature written in petroleum. Silas led her toward the formation of motorcycles that waited along the street like sleeping predators, their chrome reflecting the dying light of a sun that seemed in no hurry to witness what came next. 22 pairs of eyes tracked her movement as she walked between the bikes. Hard eyes belonging to hard people who had spent their lives in a world where softness was a liability and trust was a currency more valuable than gold. Piper felt their assessment like physical pressure against her skin. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply measuring, calculating, determining whether the girl in the dead man's jacket was worth the blood that protecting her would inevitably cost. Silas handed her a helmet. "You ever been on a motorcycle?" Piper shook her head. "Trust your rider, lean with the turns. What you see tonight stays between us until you decide what to do with it." The helmet smelled of leather and old smoke, and the particular chemical signature of a life spent moving at dangerous speeds through landscapes that did not care whether you survived the journey. But it fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her head specifically. They rode for what felt like hours into the deepening desert night, the highway unspooling beneath them like a ribbon of darkness lit by 23 headlights in perfect formation. Eventually, Silas downshifted and turned off the main road onto a track Piper had never noticed, though she had passed it 1,000 times on the school bus. The desert swallowed them whole, and when they emerged into a clearing surrounded by the weathered remains of an old mining camp, Piper understood that she had crossed a threshold that existed on no map. The boneyard was not abandoned, it was hidden. Motorcycles sat in neat rows between the buildings, and figures emerged from the structures like shadows given form. More people than Piper had expected. A community, not just a club. Men and women whose faces bore the particular stillness of people who had learned to exist in the spaces between the law and the land, answering to codes older than any statute. "Welcome to the boneyard," Silas said, killing the engine. "Last refuge of the dust devils, the place your grandfather helped build before he chose love over loyalty." An older woman emerged from the largest building, and her presence drew every eye in the clearing the way a magnet draws iron filings. She was perhaps 65, her gray hair braided with leather cord and silver rings, her jacket covered in patches that spoke of decades of earned authority. She moved with the confident stride of someone who had been giving orders for so long that obedience had become the natural response to her existence. When her eyes found Piper, her weathered face cracked into a grin that transformed her entirely, stripping away the years and the hardness and revealing something underneath that was pure, unguarded joy. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, her voice rough as sandpaper drawn across old wood. Emmett Calloway's grandbaby wearing his colors like she was born to them. And she approached Piper with her hand extended, and when Piper took it, the woman's grip was strong enough to communicate volumes about the kind of life those hands had lived. "I'm Lorraine Bassett. Everyone here calls me Crow. I was your grandfather's president before he went civilian. He was in a motorcycle club." Piper said it as a statement, not a question, because by now the denial would have been insulting to both of them. "Girl, your grandfather didn't just belong to a club." Crow's laugh echoed off the surrounding rocks, carrying warmth and pain in equal measure. "Emmett Calloway was Dust Devil royalty, and that patch you're wearing, that's his lieutenant's colors, the rank that made him second in command of the most feared brotherhood the desert has ever known." A woman with a jagged scar running from her temple to her jaw approached, carrying a leather-bound book that looked as though it had survived more than its share of fires and floods. Her name, Piper would learn, was Darlene Nolan, though the Dust Devils called her Scarlet, and the story behind her scar was one that nobody told without permission. "These are the genealogies," Scarlet said, her voice surprisingly gentle for someone whose face told such a violent story. "Every Dust Devil bloodline for 3 generations, including the ones who chose different paths." She opened the book, and Piper watched pages turn that crackled like autumn leaves in a fire. Names and dates and symbols, an entire history written in ink and leather, and the handwriting of people who understood that some things must be recorded to survive. Scarlet found the page she was looking for, and Piper saw her grandfather's name written in strong block letters. Emmett Calloway, lieutenant rank, joined 1985. Went civilian, 2002. Below that, a single daughter, Jolene Calloway. And below that in ink that was newer than the rest, a name that made Piper's heart stop. Piper Calloway, her own name written in this book before she had ever known it existed. Beside it, drawn with careful precision, the same symbol that lived on the back of her jacket, the serpent coiled around the flaming wheel. Placed there not as an afterthought, but as a declaration, a prophecy, a choice made by a man who had known even then that his granddaughter would someday stand in this circle of firelight and face the weight of everything he had left behind. He chose you, Crow said quietly, standing beside Piper as she stared at her own name in the Book of the Dead. Before you could walk, before you could talk, Emmett looked at you in your crib and told me that one. She's the one who will finish it. Finish what? Crow exchanged a glance with Silas that carried the weight of shared history and shared grief. The ritual has to be completed, she said. When the Sidewinders arrive, you either claim your inheritance formally or renounce it forever. There's no middle ground with blood oaths. What does claiming it mean? Crow's eyes never left Piper's face. It means you become what your grandfather was, a war chief with the authority to speak for every adust devil in the Southwest. It means taking responsibility for decisions that could get people killed. She paused, and the firelight caught the silver in her braids. It also means the power to end a conflict that has been bleeding these deserts dry for 20 years. Piper felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had built her identity on, the poor girl, the outcast, the invisible child in the dead man's jacket, was dissolving into something larger and infinitely more dangerous. Your grandfather didn't just walk away from the club, Crow continued, her voice dropping to a register that demanded absolute attention. He was trying to end a war, a real one, not with guns, but with truth. He believed that peace could be built between the desert clubs, that the killing could stop, that men and women on both sides could lay down their grudges and build something worth passing on. Crow paused, and in the silence, Piper heard the fire crackle and the wind whisper through the old mining structures and the distant sound of her own heartbeat, measuring out the seconds of a life that was changing with every breath. I lost my son in that war, Crow said. 19 years old. Rode into an ambush that never should have happened. When they brought his body back, I wanted to burn everything. The club, the colors, the whole desert. Burn it all down and let God sort through the ashes. Her weathered hand found Piper's shoulder, and the weight of it carried more comfort than Piper had felt in years. Your grandfather sat with me for 3 days. Didn't say much. Didn't try to make it better. Just sat there letting me rage and crane and tear the world apart with my bare hands. And on the third day, he said the only thing that could have reached me. He said, your boy died believing peace was possible. If you burn it all down, you burn his faith along with it. Crow's grip tightened. That man saved my life with those words. Not because they took the pain away, because they gave the pain a purpose. And now I'm looking at his granddaughter, wearing his colors, standing in the place he built. And I'm telling you the same thing he told me. This pain you're inheriting, this weight, it has a purpose. The question is whether you're brave enough to find it. Piper opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. Instead, a sound reached them that silenced every voice, instilled every movement in the boneyard. The deep, aggressive roar of approaching engines. Not the synchronized rumble of the dust devils. Something harsher, meaner. The sound of machines pushed hard by riders who did not care about stealth or courtesy or arriving on schedule. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the weapon at his hip, with the practiced speed of a man who had been reaching for that weapon his entire adult life. Around the fire, 20 dust devils moved with lethal efficiency, positions, shifting weapons appearing from places Piper had not known weapons could be hidden. Too early, Crow growled, her face hardening from grandmother to general in the space of a single breath. They weren't supposed to be here until tomorrow night. The rumble grew louder, closer, resolving into individual engines, each one carrying its own note of aggression, creating a harmony of approaching violence that made the desert air itself feel dangerous. Sidewinders, Scarlet hissed, slamming the genealogy book shut and rolling it into its protective cloth with the speed of someone protecting something more valuable than gold. They're riding in hot, formation approach. Piper felt herself being pushed toward the center of the dust devil's circle, hands guiding her firmly but not roughly, bodies positioning themselves between her and the approaching darkness. She understood then with a clarity that cut through her fear like sunlight through storm clouds, that she was not merely wearing her grandfather's jacket, she was wearing a declaration of war. Every person in this circle was prepared to die for the patch on her back, for the name written in the genealogy book, for the promise made by a dead man to a granddaughter who had inherited his burden without her knowledge or consent. The engines reached a crescendo that shook the ground beneath their feet. Then silence fell sudden and complete, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of boots on gravel as unseen riders dismounted in the darkness beyond the firelight. Crow grabbed Piper's shoulders, her grip iron, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that bridged the gap between terror and absolute determination. Listen to me, girl. What happens next is going to test everything you think you know about yourself. The Sidewinders are here for you specifically, for that patch, for your grandfather's blood running through your veins. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more force than a shout. They are not planning to ask politely. Piper stood at the center of the circle, surrounded by people who had chosen to protect her, feeling the weight of her grandfather's legacy pressing down on her shoulders with a force that seemed to grow with every passing second. The desert night pressed against their island of firelight from all sides, full of unseen threats and the approaching footsteps of men who had been waiting 20 years for this moment. The jacket that had been hidden for 12 years had just made her the most visible person in the Nevada desert, and the people who were looking for her had finally arrived. Vernon Slade stepped into the firelight like a man walking onto a stage he had built with his own hands. The flames caught the angles of his face, all hard edges and deep lines cut by decades of desert sun and the particular kind of hatred that feeds on itself until it becomes the only thing keeping a man alive. His shaved head was covered in tattoos that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing light, serpents and skulls and symbols that told the story of a life spent choosing violence over everything else the world had to offer. Behind him, the Sidewinders materialized from the darkness like ghosts assembling for Judgment Day. Not 7 as the Dust Devils had anticipated, not a scouting party or an advance team sent to negotiate terms. 30 men and women armed and positioned with the disciplined precision of people who had rehearsed this moment, who had driven hundreds of miles across the Nevada desert for the specific purpose of standing in this circle of light and finishing something that had started before Piper Calloway was born. Emmett Calloway's granddaughter. Rattler's voice carried across the clearing with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. His eyes found Piper at the center of the Dust Devils' defensive circle, and they stayed there with the cold focus of a predator that had located its prey after a very long hunt. I can smell his coward blood from here. Same stink, same weakness. Wearing his lieutenant's patch like you earned it instead of inheriting it from a dead man who didn't have the spine to face what he owed. Silas stepped forward, positioning himself between Piper and the approaching threat. His hand rested on the weapon at his hip, not drawing it but making its presence known with the quiet confidence of someone who had used it many times before and would use it again without hesitation. The girl's under Dust Devil protection. You want her, you go through all of us. Rattler's laugh was genuine delight, the sound of a man who had been hoping for exactly this response. Oh, I was counting on that, Silas. Wouldn't have brought 30 of my best if I was planning on a conversation. He raised one hand, a casual gesture that carried the weight of absolute command, and the darkness behind the Sidewinders erupted with movement. More figures emerging from positions they had held in perfect silence, spreading across the perimeter of the boneyard like a net being drawn tight around a school of fish that had nowhere left to swim. Piper's stomach dropped as she counted. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. The Dust Devils had 20 fighters. The Sidewinders had more than double that number, and the positions they had taken surrounding the camp from multiple angles cut off every possible route of retreat. You always were too sentimental, Silas, Rattler continued, his voice carrying the conversational ease of someone discussing the weather rather than the imminent death of everyone present. Emmett had the same disease, couldn't make the hard choices when they mattered most, couldn't cut what needed cutting. His eyes found Piper again, and his smile widened until it showed too many teeth. Tell me, little girl, how many people are you willing to watch die for the privilege of wearing dead man's clothes? The question hit like a fist to the chest. Piper turned, and what she saw behind her made the desert air feel colder than any winter she had known. Crow's weathered face set in grim determination, accepting a fate she had ridden hundreds of miles to meet. Silas's hand steady on his weapon despite odds that made steadiness meaningless. Scarlet clutching the genealogy book against her chest, like a mother holding a child. 20 men and women who had come here because they believed in a dead man's promise and were about to pay for that belief with their lives. All of them willing to die for a 12-year-old girl who had learned about her legacy less than 2 hours ago. 10 seconds, Rattler announced, checking his watch with theatrical precision that was designed to maximize the cruelty of the countdown. Then my boys start collecting the debt your grandfather left unpaid. 10. Piper's hands moved to the jacket's zipper. She could not be responsible for this slaughter. Could not stand here in borrowed leather while people who barely knew her bled into the desert sand for a bloodline they believed was worth more than their own survival. 9, 8. Piper, don't. Crow's voice carried decades of command, but also something that might have been pleading. The sound of a woman who had already buried one person she loved because of this war and could not bear to watch the next generation surrender before the fight had even begun. Your grandfather died believing his blood would finish what he started. Don't let that sacrifice mean nothing. 7, 6. The jacket's leather whispered against itself as Piper's fingers found the zipper pull and began to draw it down. Around her, dust devils tensed for a fight they could not win, their loyalty to a dead man's granddaughter about to cost them everything they had. 5, 4. The zipper moved down 6 inches, then stopped. Something was wrong with the jacket's weight, a hardness against her ribs that had not been there before, or rather had always been there, but hidden so well that neither she nor her mother had ever noticed. Her fingers explored the inner lining, finding a seam that was not quite a seam, a pocket that had been sewn shut with thread that matched the leather so perfectly it was invisible to anyone who was not searching for it with desperate fumbling fingers. 3, 2. Piper tore the stitching open. Her hand closed around 2 objects wrapped in oiled leather, the same kind of protective wrapping she had seen on old gun barrels in movies and museum displays. The first was small and heavy and metallic. The second was flat and thin, the unmistakable shape of a photograph. 1. She pulled both free as Rattler's countdown reached 0. The pistol was small, silver, deadly, its grip worn smooth by years of handling. Initials had been carved into the metal with the careful precision of a man marking something he intended to pass on. E.C. Emmett Calloway. Her grandfather's weapon hidden in his jacket, like a final message from beyond the grave. Time's up. Rattler's smile widened as he watched her fumble with the unfamiliar weapon, a 12-year-old girl holding a pistol. She had never fired facing down 30 armed killers, with nothing but inherited leather and a dead man's gun. Looks like Emmett's bloodline ends with a whimper. The first shot came from the darkness beyond the Sidewinders' positions, a muzzle flash that lit up the desert for a split second, turning the night into a frozen photograph of violence about to begin. One of Rattler's men spun and felt the impact, carrying him off his feet and depositing him in the sand with a sound that was somehow worse than the gunshot itself. Dust devils who had been positioned as outer security opened fire from concealment, their shots disciplined and precise, each one finding a target or forcing a Sidewinder into cover. But there were not enough of them. For every Sidewinder who fell, 2 more returned fire, their bullets tearing through the camp with a ferocity that turned the boneyard into a killing ground. Piper dropped to her knees as rounds whistled overhead, the pistol slipping from her untrained fingers to land in the sand beside her. Around her, the world dissolved into chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed across the clearing. The air filled with the crack of gunfire, the shouts of men and women fighting for their lives, and the sharp metallic smell of cordite that burned the back of her throat. Silas threw himself across the fire pit, his body colliding with Piper's and rolling them both behind a stack of rusted mining equipment that offered minimal cover but was better than the open ground where bullets were chewing the earth into fountains of sand and gravel. His arms wrapped around her with the desperate strength of a man protecting something more valuable than himself. "Stay down," he shouted over the gunfire, but his voice was already changing, weakening, growing thick with the particular sound of a body trying to function while it leaked from multiple holes. Dark stains spread across his shirt, 2 wounds visible in the firelight, maybe three, each one pumping blood faster than the desert could absorb. Silas? Piper pressed her hands against the closest wound, feeling his life pulse between her fingers with a heat that seemed impossible, it as though his blood carried the temperature of the engine he had ridden for hundreds of miles to reach this place. Silas, hold on. The battle around them was turning. Bang! The Dust Devils fought with the ferocity of people defending their home, but superior numbers and positioning told the inevitable story. One by one, riders fell. A man Piper had seen feeding the fire an hour ago crumpled against the wall of the main building, his weapon still clutched in hands that would never fire again. A woman whose laughter had echoed off the rocks during Crow's story went down in the crossfire between two Sidewinder positions, her body hitting the ground with a finality that made Piper's stomach clench. Then Crow stepped into the open. The old woman moved with a purpose that transcended the chaos around her, crossing the killing ground with the determined stride of someone who had decided that this moment, this specific collection of seconds, was worth everything she had left to give. She was heading for Piper and Silas, her weathered face set in an expression that was not fear or rage or resignation, but something deeper, something that looked like completion. The burst of automatic gunfire caught her in mid-stride. 3 rounds, maybe 4. Enough to stop her forward momentum and spin her sideways, her boots leaving furrows in the sand as she tried to keep moving, tried to reach the girl in the dead man's jacket, who represented everything she had spent the last 20 years believing in. Crow went down 15 feet from Piper's position. The genealogy book tumbled from her lifeless hands, its pages scattering in the desert wind like leaves torn from a tree that had stood for generations and was now falling for the last time. 3 generations of Dust Devil history, names and dates and blood oaths lifted by the wind and carried into the darkness where they would settle in the sand and become part of the landscape itself. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. Not gradually, not winding down, but ceasing all at once, as though someone had thrown a switch that silenced every weapon simultaneously. The quiet that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of aftermath of bodies cooling and blood soaking into earth that had absorbed too much of both over too many years. Piper found herself alone with Silas's labored breathing and the approaching footsteps of Sidewinders closing in. The jacket that had once seemed like armor now felt like a burial shroud, soaked in the blood of people who had died believing she was worth saving. Rattler's shadow fell across them both, his weapon pointed at Piper's head with the casual ease of a man performing a task he had performed so many times it no longer required thought or emotion. "Disappointing," he said conversationally, his tone carrying the genuine regret of a connoisseur who had expected a better show. "I expected more fight from Emmett's granddaughter, but I suppose cowardice runs in families, same as eye color and bad luck." Piper looked up at him, the taste of failure thick in her mouth mixing with sand and the copper tang of Silas's blood on her hands. Behind Rattler's surviving, Sidewinders moved through the boneyard with methodical precision, checking bodies, collecting weapons, performing the cold arithmetic of victory. "Any last words, little girl? Something profound about family honor, about finishing what your grandfather started." But Piper was not looking at his gun anymore. Her eyes had found something else. Among the scattered pages of the genealogy book caught against a stone near her feet lay the photograph she had pulled from the jacket's hidden pocket. It had fallen during the chaos landing face up in the firelight, its image clear despite the yellowed edges and the fold mark running through its center. 3 men stood beside their motorcycles in the photograph, and Piper recognized 2 of them instantly. The first was her grandfather, younger by 20 years, his face unlined by the guilt and isolation that would eventually consume his final decade. He was smiling. Not the hard, dangerous smile she had imagined a motorcycle club lieutenant would wear, but something genuine and open, the smile of a man among friends who believed in what they were building together. The second man was Rattler, also younger, also smiling, his arm draped across Emmett's shoulders with the easy affection of a brother, not an enemy. The shaved head and the tattoos were absent, replaced by a full head of dark hair and a face that had not yet been carved into its current mask of calculated cruelty. The third man stood between them, shorter than both, with a broad grin and a beer bottle raised toward the camera in a toast. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in her grandfather's handwriting, "Desert Brotherhood Summit, June 1st. and beside that date, three sets of initials: ECVS, TS, Emmett Calloway, Vernon Slade, Tommy Slade. The revelation hit Piper with the force of a physical blow, rearranging everything she thought she understood about the war that had shaped her life. "You're lying," Rattler paused. His weapon wavered by a fraction of an inch. "What? Everything you've said about my grandfather being a traitor, about him betraying the Brotherhood." Piper's voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by the sudden clarity of understanding that comes when the final piece of a puzzle clicks into place and reveals a picture entirely different from what you expected. "He wasn't your enemy. He was your friend." She held up the photograph with blood-stained fingers, turning it so the firelight caught the image clearly. "This is from the Brotherhood Summit. You and my grandfather, standing together, smiling." She paused, letting the image speak its truth to every pair of eyes that could see it. "And the man between you. That's Tommy, isn't it? Your brother." The silence that followed was different from the silence of ceasing gunfire. This was the silence of certainty cracking of foundations built on decades of lies, beginning to shift under the weight of a single photograph held by a 12-year-old girl kneeling in blood and sand. "Where did you find that?" Rattler's voice had lost its theatrical menace. What remained was raw and exposed the voice of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "In the jacket you've been trying to destroy for 20 years. Piper felt strength flowing into her from a source she could not name. Not courage exactly, something older. The particular power that comes from holding truth in your hands when everyone around you has been living inside a lie. "My grandfather didn't kill Tommy. Tommy supported the peace talks just like my grandfather did. They were working together." She looked past Rattler at the assembled Sidewinders, seeing uncertainty creep into expressions that had been carved from stone moments before. Weapons that had been held with lethal confidence now hung at angles that suggested doubt. Eyes that had watched their leader with unquestioning loyalty now darted between Rattler's face and the photograph in Piper's hand, performing calculations that no amount of charisma could override. "You've been hunting my family for 20 years, Piper said, and her voice carried across the desert clearing with an authority that had nothing to do with age or days and everything to do with the undeniable gravity of truth spoken aloud in a place where lies had ruled for far too long. "Not because my grandfather betrayed you, because he knew the truth about what really happened to your brother, and you needed him dead before he could prove it." Piper did not wait for Rattler's response. She did not need to. Instead, she turned her attention to the Sidewinders, who stood in a loose semicircle behind their leader, and she found the face she was looking for. A lean man in his 50s with silver threading through his beard and eyes that held the particular sharpnesses of someone who had survived by paying attention to details that others overlooked. Merle Briggs. She did not know his name yet, but she recognized something in his face that the others did not share. Not doubt, something deeper. The expression of a man who had been carrying a question for 20 years and had just heard the first syllable of its answer. Piper held the photograph toward him. "You knew Tommy Slade, didn't you?" The lean man's eyes widened. He stepped forward, reaching for the photograph with a hand that trembled, despite the calluses and the weathering that spoke of a lifetime of gripping handlebars in desert wind. "Tommy was my cousin," he said, and his voice cut through the clearing like a blade drawn from a sheath that had held it too long. "I rode with him for 15 years before he died." His eyes never left the photograph as his fingers traced the image of the man standing between Emmett Calloway and Vernon Slade, three friends captured in a moment of hope that someone had systematically erased from history. "You looked me in the eye at his funeral, Rattler. You swore on his grave that Emmett Calloway pulled the trigger, that he shot Tommy in the back during a raid while Tommy was trying to surrender." Rattler's composure cracked. Not completely, not yet, but the fracture was visible to everyone who cared to look. "Those pictures prove nothing, Merle. People change. Alliances shift. Emmett chose his side when he what?" Piper interrupted, and the steel in her voice surprised everyone, including herself. "When he tried to stop someone from murdering peacemakers. When he chose building something over destroying everything." She looked at Merle, then at the photograph, then back at Merle. "Ask him. Ask Rattler how Tommy really died. Because that picture shows Tommy standing with the man who supposedly killed him, and they're not fighting. They're not enemies. They're celebrating something they were building together. Merle dropped the photograph and stepped toward Rattler with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had just watched a wall he had been leaning against for 2 decades dissolve into sand. "You lying piece of—" His voice cracked with 20 years of grief compressed into a single sentence. "You killed Tommy yourself, didn't you? Killed him and blamed it on the Dust Devils to keep the war going, to keep yourself in power." The accusation hung in the desert air, like smoke from a fire that had been burning underground for 20 years and had finally broken through the surface. Piper watched Rattler's face cycle through rage, fear, and the desperate calculation of a man who had run out of lies and was searching for one final deception that might hold the crumbling architecture of his authority together. He could not find it. "So what if I did?" The words exploded from Rattler like pressure released from a vessel that had been sealed too long. His mask dropped completely, and what lay beneath was not the calculating predator who had orchestrated 20 years of desert warfare, but something smaller, something desperate, something that had been running from its own truth for so long that it had forgotten what standing still felt like. Tommy was weak. He was going to give away everything our fathers built: the territories, the trade routes, the respect that our colors command. All of it thrown away for some fantasy about desert brotherhood. His weapon swung wildly as he spoke, pointing at ghosts that only he could see. "I saved the Sidewinders from that weakness. I kept us strong when everyone else wanted to surrender our birthright for a handshake and a photograph. By murdering your own blood." Scarlett's voice came from somewhere to Piper's left, weak but alive. The Dust Devil woman had dragged herself to a sitting position against a stack of old mining timbers, one hand pressed against the wound in her shoulder, the other gripping a pistol that she held not to threaten, but to bear witness. By feeding 20 years of hate with lies and manipulation. By sending good men to die for feuds you manufactured. One of the Sidewinders, a thick-necked man with road dust in his beard, lowered his weapon entirely and took a step backward. Then another Sidewinder did the same. Then 3 more. The disciplined formation that had encircled the boneyard was dissolving not through violence or command, but through the simple, devastating power of truth admitted in the hearing of people who had sacrificed everything for what they now learned was a fiction. Merle did not ask permission. He did not look to his fellow Sidewinders for consensus. He crossed the distance between himself and Rattler, in 4 strides pulled the weapon from the man's unresisting hand, and drove his fist into his former leader's jaw with the accumulated force of 20 years of misdirected grief. Rattler went down hard, his body hitting the sand with a sound that seemed to punctuate the end of something that should have ended 2 decades ago. "Somebody get me a rope," Merle called out, and his voice carried the raw authority of a man who had just seized command not by choice but by the absolute necessity of the moment. "We got 20 years of lies to sort through, and this bastard's going to answer for every one of them." Piper let the breath she had been holding escape in a long, shaking exhale. Her legs trembled beneath her, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the last 10 minutes beginning to drain away and leave behind the bone-deep exhaustion of a child who had just faced death and found something worse on the other side. Not violence, not hatred, the simple, terrible weight of being right. She collapsed beside Silas, whose eyes had found enough strength to focus on her face despite the blood loss that had turned his skin the color of old paper. The Dust Devil woman, Scarlett, had crawled to his side and was pressing torn fabric against his wounds with hands that shook but did not hesitate. "Smart girl." Silas's whisper came out flecked with the blood, but his eyes held something that looked like pride. Emmett always said the truth was in the details. Looks like he passed that down along with the jacket. Around them, the impossible work of aftermath began. Sidewinders and Dust Devils moved through the clearing together for the first time in 20 years, tending to wounded from both sides with the awkward, hesitant cooperation of people who had been enemies so long that they had forgotten how to be anything else. Hands that had been holding weapons moments before now pressed bandages against injuries. Voices that had been shouting kill commands now asked whether anyone had water, whether anyone had medical training, whether anyone knew how to stop the bleeding from a wound that went deeper than flesh. Piper gathered the scattered photographs from the genealogy book's pages while Scarlett worked on Silas's wounds. Most of the pages were ruin-soaked in blood or torn beyond recovery, but the photographs had survived. Images of Dust Devils and Sidewinders working together, laughing together, building something that had been systematically destroyed by a man who valued power over every other human possibility. She held each photograph up to the firelight, reading the stories written in faded ink on their backs, names she did not recognize, dates that mapped a history of cooperation that had been erased so thoroughly that even the people who had lived it had begun to doubt their own memories. The documentation your grandfather left. Silas's voice pulled her back. He was propped against a mining cart now, Scarlett's field dressing, keeping him alive, but not comfortable, his pale eyes burning with an urgency that transcended his physical condition. There's more than what was in the jacket. He left a safety deposit box in Redstone Gap. His breath caught and Scarlett pressed harder on the wound. The key is sewn into the jacket's lining, along the hem. Piper's fingers found the hem of the jacket and ran along its edge until they met a small, hard object hidden between the layers of leather. She worked it free with trembling hands. A small brass key wrapped in the same old leather that had protected the pistol. It was warm from her body heat, as though it had been waiting against her skin for 3 weeks, patient and purposeful, knowing that its moment would come. Evidence that could clear a lot of names. Silas continued, his gaze shifting to include the Sidewinders who had gathered within hearing distance. Documentation of who really killed the peacemakers, who really sabotaged the Brotherhood compact. His eyes locked on Rattler's prone form, bound and bleeding in the sand. Who really murdered Tommy Slade? Merle stood over Rattler, his face a map of emotions too complex to name. Grief and rage, and the particular devastation of discovering that the ground you have been standing on for 20 years was never solid to begin with. He looked at Piper, at the key in her hand, and something passed between them. Not trust exactly. Trust would take time and evidence, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding what Rattler had spent 2 decades tearing down. But something adjacent to trust, a willingness to follow the truth wherever it led, regardless of how much damage it caused along the way. "Where's this safety deposit box?" Merle asked. "First National Bank, Redstone Gap." Piper held up the key. "Box 247. The decision to ride together happened without discussion. There was no vote, no negotiation, no formal agreement between the clubs. The wounded were loaded onto bikes with the careful efficiency of people who understood that speed mattered more than comfort, and the caravan that formed in the Boneyard's clearing looked like nothing the Nevada desert had ever produced. Dust devils and sidewinders riding side by side, their colors mixing in the headlight beams like paints bleeding together on a canvas that nobody had planned, but everyone understood was being created in real time. Piper rode behind Merle on his massive Harley, her grandfather's jacket streaming behind her in the desert wind. The key pressed against her palm, its brass edges cutting into skin that was already raw from gripping Silas's wounds. Behind them, Silas rode with Scarlett, supporting him from the passenger position, his condition stable enough for travel, but deteriorating with every mile. They made Redstone Gap in under 20 minutes, the combined engines of 30-odd motorcycles creating a thunder that rattled every window on Main Street and brought the town's few remaining residents to their porches in various states of alarm and fascination. The caravan rolled past the hardware store, past the laundromat, past the empty storefronts that lined the road like tombstones, marking the death of small-town ambition. And there it was, First National Bank of Redstone Gap. Or rather, there it wasn't. The building stood dark and abandoned behind a chain-link fence, its windows boarded, its doors padlocked, its facade crumbling with the particular neglect of a structure that nobody cared enough about to either maintain or demolish. A weathered sign, barely legible in the motorcycle headlights, proclaimed, "Permanently closed, assets transferred to Nevada Central Banking." Piper's heart sank through her stomach and kept going, falling through layers of hope and determination until it landed somewhere cold and hollow. She stood in the empty parking lot, surrounded by 30 bikers who had risked everything on her promise of evidence, of answers, of some way to honor their dead without adding to the body count. And the building that was supposed to contain her grandfather's truth was a shell, an empty box, a dead end lit by headlights that illuminated nothing but failure. Rattler, propped between 2 sidewinders who held him upright out of duty rather than compassion, managed a laugh that sounded like glass breaking on concrete. "Did you really think it would be that easy, that your grandfather's fantasies would survive 20 years of reality? Banks close, little girl. Boxes get transferred or auctioned or lost. Whatever Emmett thought he was protecting died with this building. The fragile alliance Piper had forged began to crack around her. She could see it happening in real time, watching doubt creep into eyes that had briefly held hope. Sidewinders exchanged glances that carried the wordless vocabulary of men reconsidering their choices. Dust devils shifted on their bikes, the reality of their losses at the boneyard settling in now that the adrenaline of revelation had worn off. Crow was dead. Half their fighters were wounded. And the evidence that was supposed to justify all of it was locked inside a building that no longer existed as anything more than architecture. One of the sidewinders growled, his hand drifting toward the weapon at his hip. We followed a little girl chasing ghost stories while our brothers are bleeding in the sand. But Piper was not listening to him. She was staring at the weathered sign on the bank's door, reading the words that everyone else had dismissed as the final period on a dead sentence. Assets transferred. Transferred did not mean destroyed. Transferred meant moved. And moved meant somewhere, and somewhere meant someone had moved them. Harlon Puit, the old man in the repair shop whose face had gone white at the sight of the patch. The business card in the lockbox, box 247. The way he had told her to take off the jacket and go home, not with the irritation of a man bothered by a child, but with the urgency of a man who knew exactly what that jacket meant and was terrified of what its appearance might set in motion. The bank manager, Piper said, and her voice cut through the growing tension like a blade. Harlon Puit. He used to run First National before it closed. I talked to him this morning. He's still here in Redstone Gap. She looked at the assembled bikers, seeing attention replace doubt in their faces. When a bank closes, someone has to take custody of the remaining assets. Safety deposit boxes don't just vanish. The contents get transferred, and someone signs for them. Scarlett, supporting Silas, who had managed to stay upright through sheer determination, spoke from behind the gathered crowd. Pruitt's fix it, end of Main Street. That's where he works now. Piper felt the moment balancing on the razor's edge between collapse and continuation. One wrong word, one gesture interpreted as weakness, and the alliance she had built from blood and photographs and the desperate authority of a dead man's granddaughter would shatter into 30 armed individuals with no reason to trust each other and every reason to return to the familiar comfort of 2 decades of organized hatred. She never got the chance to find the right word. The sound came from the east, from the direction of the highway where it crested the ridge that marked the boundary between Redstone Gap and the open desert beyond. Not the familiar thunder of Harleys or the aggressive snarl of the Sidewinders' machines. This was different, bigger, deeper. The sound of heavier engines pushed hard by riders who were not trying to be quiet, who wanted the world to hear them coming and to understand what that sound meant. Merle's head snapped toward the highway, and the color drained from his face in a way that told Piper everything she needed to know before he spoke the words. Stone Kings. The name rippled through both clubs like an electric current, transforming the atmosphere from tense negotiation to immediate visceral fear. Piper had never heard the name before, but the reaction it produced in men and women who had spent their lives in the desert's violent ecosystem told her everything she needed to understand. How many? Silas asked, his voice thin but alert. Merle was already climbing it onto his motorcycle, scanning the eastern horizon, where dust clouds were becoming visible against the stars. Too many, and they're not here to talk. Piper felt the full weight of the situation crash down on her shoulders. The Stone Kings. The third club in the desert hierarchy, bigger than the Sidewinders and the Dust Devils combined. They had stayed out of the 20-year war with the patient calculation of vultures, circling above a fight, content to claim whatever territory the conflict left undefended. But 30 riders from both enemy clubs rolling into town together, their engines announcing an alliance that had been unthinkable 24 hours ago, that would look like a threat. The kind of threat that demanded a response. The headlights appeared over the ridge like stars being born on the horizon. 40 motorcycles, maybe more, descending toward Redstone Gap in a formation that spoke of overwhelming force, deployed with complete confidence. Their engines created a wall of sound that rolled across the desert and bounced off the empty buildings of Main Street, filling every space with the deep vibration of approaching judgment. The lead bike was enormous, built for a man of extraordinary size, its chrome catching the streetlights and throwing reflections across the facades of buildings that had not seen this much activity since the mine closed 20 years ago. The rider matched his machine, 6.5 feet of muscle packed into a leather jacket that strained across shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, his beard hanging to his chest, his arms thick as bridge cables crossed with scars that told stories Piper did not want to hear. He brought his convoy to a halt 50 yards from where the Sidewinders and Dust Devils waited, his raised fist commanding instant obedience from every rider behind him. The silence that followed the dying of 40 engines was absolute, charged with the particular tension of a moment that could explode in any direction. Well, well. His voice carried across the gap between them. Without effort, a bass rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from any human throat. Look what we've got here. Snakes and dust riders playing nice in the sandbox. His laugh was like gravel tumbling in a cement mixer. You know what happens to clubs that forget their place in my territory. Piper felt the alliance disintegrating around her. 30 people who had survived 20 years of war by trusting nobody were now being asked to stand together against a force that outnumbered them by a significant margin, and the mathematics of survival were screaming at each of them to scatter, to run, to save themselves, and abandon whatever fragile hope had brought them to this parking lot in front of an empty bank. Weapons appeared. Old instincts overrode new realizations. Sidewinders and Dust Devils, who had been cooperating minutes ago, now calculated angles of retreat that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with individual survival. The man on the massive bike dismounted slowly, each boot hitting the asphalt, with the deliberate weight of someone who understood that his physical presence was a weapon more effective than anything holstered at his hip. Sledge Bodine. The name came to Piper from somewhere, perhaps whispered by a dust devil behind her, perhaps rising from the depths of a genetic memory she had not known she carried. The leader of the Stone Kings, the largest, most dangerous man in the Nevada desert. He walked toward the gathered bikers with the unhurried stride of a man who had never needed to rush in his life because the world had always arranged itself around his schedule. His eyes swept across the Sidewinders and Dust Devils, cataloging faces and weapons, and the particular body language of people trying to decide between fight and flight. Then his gaze found Piper. Traveled down the oversized jacket to the rolled sleeves across the worn leather, to the place between her shoulder blades, where the patch sat like a challenge stitched in silver thread. He stopped walking. The desert wind pushed against his beard, and for a moment the only sound was the tick of cooling engines and the distant cry of a desert hawk circling somewhere in the darkness above. "That's interesting ink you're wearing, little girl," Sledge Bodine said, and his voice had dropped from its earlier roar to something quieter. Something that carried more weight precisely because it carried less volume. "Real interesting." Piper stood in the space between 30 wounded allies and 40 fresh enemies, holding a brass key to a box that might not exist anymore, wearing a dead man's jacket that had started a war and might yet end one, and she understood with perfect crystalline clarity that this was not an accident. This was not bad luck or bad timing or the random cruelty of a universe that did not care about 12-year-old girls with inherited leather and inherited debt. This was the test, the real one. Everything that had happened tonight, the revelations, the violence, the fragile alliance forged in blood and photographs, had been leading to this moment. Her grandfather had known, had planned for this, had understood that peace between two clubs meant nothing if the third could destroy it with a single show of force. True peace could not be built on shared enemies. It could only be forged by facing a common threat together. And the threat was here, standing 6.5 feet tall, with arms like bridge cables, asking her a question that would determine whether everyone behind her lived or died. "That patch belonged to Emmett Calloway," Sledge continued, circling her slowly, his boots heavy on the cracked asphalt. "Mean old bastard who could split a man in half with his bare hands and quote scripture while he did it." He completed his circle and stood before her close enough that his shadow swallowed her entirely. "You're what, 12, 13? What makes you think you can wear a dead man's authority?" Piper looked up at the largest man she had ever seen, and she felt her grandfather's presence settle around her shoulders like a second jacket, invisible but undeniable. She felt Crow's sacrifice pressing against her back alongside the patch, felt Silas's blood drying on her hands, felt the weight of every person standing behind her, whose life depended on what she said next. "Because he chose me to finish what he started," she said, and her voice did not break. "Because someone has to. And because I'm the only one standing here with the truth and the proof to back it up. Sledge studied her face the way a man studies a map of unfamiliar territory, searching for landmarks that might tell him whether the ground ahead was solid or would swallow him whole. And what truth would that be? That everyone standing in this street has been lied to. Sidewinders, dust devils, and stone kings alike. That a war that should have ended 20 years ago was kept alive by one man's greed, and that the evidence to prove it is sitting in a box less than 200 yards from where we're standing. She held up the brass key, its surface catching the streetlight. And that my grandfather gave his life to make sure this moment would happen. All three clubs, in the same place at the same time, facing the truth together. Sledge Bodine looked at the key, then at the assembled bikers behind her, then at his own 40 riders who waited on their machines with the patient discipline of men accustomed to following a leader whose judgment they did not question. The truth, he said slowly, has a way of cutting everyone who touches it, little girl. You sure you want to bleed? Piper thought of Crow falling into the firelight, of Silas's blood between her fingers, of her mother's tears and her grandfather's silence in 12 years of poverty and invisibility that had led by some path too complex for any map to trace to this precise moment on this cracked street in this dying town. I've been bleeding my whole life, she said. I just didn't know what the wound was until tonight. Sledge Bodine held her gaze for what felt like the length of a lifetime compressed into seconds. Then he turned to face both clubs, his massive frame positioned between the Stone Kings and the fragile alliance, like a wall that could fall in either direction. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and gun smoke, and the distant promise of a dawn that was still hours away. 40 Stone Kings waited for their leader's decision. 30 Sidewinders and Dust Devils waited for their fate. And Piper Calloway, 12 years old, wearing a dead man's jacket and holding a dead man's key, waited for the answer that would determine whether her grandfather's dreams survived the night or died in the street with everyone who believed in it. The silence between Piper and Sledge Bodine stretched across the street like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Behind her, 30 wounded bikers held their breath. In front of her, 40 Stone Kings sat on their machines like statues cast in chrome and leather, waiting for their leader to decide whether the next few minutes would end in conversation or carnage. Piper did not reach for the pistol tucked inside the jacket. She did not raise her voice or make threats or attempt the kind of theatrical bravado that Rattler had wielded like a weapon. She simply stood there, 12 years old, wearing a jacket that was too big for her body, but no longer too big for her shoulders, and spoke the only language that had gotten her this far: the truth. Your brother, she said, and her voice carried clearly in the desert air, despite the fact that she was speaking barely above conversational volume. My grandfather pulled him out of a burning truck in 1967. Everyone else ran. Everyone else decided that one man's life wasn't worth the risk. But Emmett Calloway went back into the fire. Sledge's expression did not change. His arms remained crossed over his massive chest, his body positioned with the absolute stillness of a man who had learned that movement without purpose was weakness. But something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition, not of the story itself, which he clearly already knew, but of the fact that this child knew it too. He told me someday his kin would come collecting, Sledge said slowly, and his voice had lost the theatrical menace of his earlier pronouncements. What remained was something rawer, closer to the bone. The voice of a man being asked to honor a debt he had always known existed, but had hoped would never be called in. Didn't expect it to be a kid with more nerve than sense. I'm not collecting a debt, Piper said. I'm offering a trade. What kind of trade? The truth about who's been playing all three of us against each other for 20 years. In exchange for 10 minutes of your time. Sledge uncrossed his arms. The gesture was small, but in the vocabulary of men who communicated through controlled violence, it was the equivalent of opening a door that had been bolted shut. He looked back at his 40 riders, reading faces and intentions with the practiced eye of a man who had maintained command for decades by understanding what his people needed before they knew it themselves. 10 minutes, he said. After that, I decide what happens to everybody standing in this street. Piper nodded. Then she turned and walked toward the far end of Main Street, toward the hand-painted sign that read Pruitt's Fix-It, toward the man who had been keeping her grandfather's secrets in a box for 12 years. She did not look back to see if anyone followed. She did not need to. The sound of boots on asphalt, dozens of them, Sidewinders and dust devils and stone kings falling into step behind a 12-year-old girl told her everything. Harlon Pruitt's shop was dark, but a light burned in the apartment above, visible through a window that looked out over the street like a watchtower manned by a single sentry. Piper climbed the 3 steps to the front door and knocked, not tentatively, not with the hesitation of the girl who had stood on this same doorstep that morning and been turned away by an old man's fear. She knocked with the authority of someone who had earned the right to demand answers by paying for them in blood that was not her own. The door opened a crack, and Harlon Pruitt's face appeared in the gap, his silver hair disheveled from sleep, his eyes blinking against the streetlight that poured in from behind Piper's silhouette. Then those eyes traveled past her to the street beyond, where 70 motorcycles and their riders waited in a formation that defied everything the Nevada desert had seen in a generation. The old man's face went through a sequence of expressions that Piper would remember for the rest of her life. Surprise, then fear, then something that looked remarkably like relief. The expression of a man who had been carrying a weight for so long that even the prospect of putting it down, regardless of the consequences, brought a kind of peace. 12 years, Harlon said, and his voice carried the hoarse quality of someone speaking words he had rehearsed in private for over a decade. 12 years I've been waiting for someone to come with that key. His eyes found the brass object in Piper's hand, and he nodded with the slow certainty of a man watching a prophecy fulfill itself. When the bank closed, they wanted to auction the unclaimed boxes. I signed for the contents personally, told the state auditor it was a legal matter pending resolution, told him the owner's family would come for it eventually. He opened the door fully and stepped aside. I suppose eventually is tonight. The interior of Harlon Pruitt's apartment was small and orderly, the living space of a man who had spent his career organizing other people's assets and applied the same principles to his own modest existence. A single bookshelf held volumes on banking law and Nevada history. A desk in the corner was covered in repair manuals, and on the floor, beneath the desk, locked inside a fireproof safe that looked like it had been built to survive the end of the world, sat the contents of Box 247. Harlon knelt beside the safe with the ceremonial precision of a priest approaching an altar. The combination lock turned under his practiced fingers, each number falling into place with a click that seemed to echo far beyond the small room. When the door swung open, Piper felt the air pressure change, as though the secrets inside had been sealed under compression and were now expanding to fill every available space. The documentation is real, Harlon said, addressing not just Piper but the faces crowding the doorway and the windows, 70 bikers pressing close to witness the opening of a box that contained the truth about 20 years of their lives. Financial records, meeting transcripts, photographs, everything Emmett Calloway gathered to prove what really happened the night the piece died. He began lifting items from the safe and placing them on his workbench with the careful reverence of an archaeologist handling artifacts that might crumble at a careless touch. Manila folders thick with documents, envelopes containing photographs that had been preserved in acid-free sleeves, and cassette tapes, 7 of them each labeled in Emmett Calloway's block handwriting, with dates and descriptions that read like chapter headings in a history book that nobody had been allowed to publish. Piper picked up the first tape. The label read, October 15th, VS phone call to SB territory deal. She looked at Harlon, who nodded toward a dusty cassette player on the shelf behind him, the kind of machine that had been obsolete for 20 years, but had survived in a repair shop where nothing was ever thrown away if it still served a purpose. She pressed play. Static filled the room, hissing and popping with the particular texture of an analog recording made on equipment that was never designed for surveillance. Then voices emerged from the noise, and the room went absolutely silent. The first voice was Rattler's, younger but carrying the same calculating cadence that Piper had heard in the boneyard, the voice of a man who treated every conversation as a transaction. The peace talks are scheduled for the 23rd. Both sides will be there. The location is the old Miller Ranch south of Highway 50. The second voice was deeper, rougher, unfamiliar to Piper, but clearly recognized by the Stone Kings who had pushed their way to the front of the crowd. Several of them exchanged glances that carried the weight of sudden, unwelcome understanding. And the Dust Devils trust you, the second voice asked. They trust my brother, Rattler replied. Tommy's the one who set up the summit. He thinks he's building peace. What he's really building is the perfect ambush. Both clubs' leadership in one place, no security, no weapons. All I need from you is 10 men on the ridge with rifles. When it's over, the Dust Devils are finished, the Sidewinders answer to me, and Stone Kings get everything south of Interstate 15. The second voice was quiet for a long time. Then in Tommy. Tommy's a casualty of the peace process. Rattler's voice carried no more emotion than a man ordering lunch. Tragic but necessary. I'll blame it on the Dust Devils. Give me my war, and I'll give you your territory. The tape hissed into silence. Piper pressed stop. The quiet that followed was not the quiet of shock. It was the quiet of 70 people, simultaneously recalculating 20 years of their lives, revising every assumption, every loyalty, every decision made in the name of a conflict that had been manufactured by a man who sat bound and bleeding in the street below. Sledge Bodine was the first to speak. His voice came out low and controlled, but beneath the control lay a tremor that spoke of violence being held in check by nothing more than willpower. That second voice, he paused. That's Garrett Finch, my predecessor, the man who ran the Stone Kings before I took over. He made the deal with Rattler, Piper said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that needed to be spoken aloud so that everyone in the room could hear it and understand its implications. Your club was part of it from the beginning, not because you chose to be, but because your leader chose for you, just like Rattler chose for the Sidewinders. Sledge turned toward the window, looking down at the street where his 40 riders waited beside the Sidewinders and Dust Devils they had been taught to view as enemies or prey. Garrett told us the Dust Devils were expanding, said they'd made an alliance with the Sidewinders to push us out of southern Nevada. His massive hands gripped the windowsill, and Piper heard the wood creak under the pressure. We lost 11 men in the first year of that war, 11 brothers who died fighting an enemy that never existed because their president sold them out for a territorial handshake. 23 Dust Devils died in the same period, Silas said from the doorway where Scarlett had helped him climb the stairs and propped him against the frame. His face was the color of old ash, but his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who refused to let his wounds silence him. And 14 Sidewinders, men and women who thought they were defending their families from genuine threats. Merle Briggs pushed forward, his face set in the particular expression of a man who had passed beyond anger into something colder and more permanent. All of them dead because two men in positions of trust decided that war was more profitable than peace. Piper spread the remaining documents across Harlan's workbench. Financial records showing money flowing between Rattler and Garrett Finch payments made for information for ambush logistics, for the systematic elimination of anyone on either side who advocated for the Brotherhood compact that Emmett Calloway had spent years trying to build. Meeting transcripts in her grandfather's handwriting, documenting conversations he had secretly recorded, evidence he had gathered with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that truth, once properly documented, becomes impossible to destroy. Photographs showed the aftermath of attacks that had been attributed to rival clubs, but were in fact orchestrated by the two men who had the most to gain from perpetual conflict. Dates and locations matched incidents that survivors in both clubs remembered, with the kind of clarity that trauma imprints on memory like a brand on flesh. He knew, Piper said, laying out the last of the documents. My grandfather knew from the very beginning that the peace talks were sabotaged from the inside. He started documenting everything the moment he suspected Rattler was working with the Stone Kings leadership. He gathered evidence for years, built a case that could prove exactly what happened and who was responsible. Then why didn't he use it? The question came from one of the Stone Kings, a woman with close-cropped hair and forearms covered in tattoos that documented her rank in history. If he had all this proof, why did he disappear instead of bringing it to the clubs? Harlan answered from his position beside the safe. Because the night he planned to present the evidence, Rattler found out. Emmett barely escaped with his life. He went into hiding the next day, and he stayed hidden for 12 years. Left Redstone Gap behind. Changed his habits. Stopped riding entirely. The old man's voice softened. He came to me the morning he left and asked me to hold the box. Said he was putting the truth in storage until the world was ready to hear it, until someone in his bloodline was strong enough to carry it where it needed to go. Piper felt the full weight of her inheritance pressing down on her in that moment, and for the first time all night, it did not feel crushing. It felt purposeful. Every piece of the puzzle her grandfather had spent decades constructing was now laid out on a workbench in a repair shop in a dying desert town, witnessed by representatives of all three clubs that had been torn apart by the very conspiracy these documents exposed. The truth was here, complete, documented, undeniable. The question was what to do with it. We can use this evidence to punish everyone who contributed to the war. Piper spoke carefully, knowing that each word carried weight that extended far beyond the room. Track down every collaborator, settle every blood debt, make sure everyone pays for what they've done. That's one choice. She picked up the last item from the safe, an envelope sealed with wax that bore the imprint of a motorcycle wheel addressed in her grandfather's handwriting to two words that made her throat tighten. My heir. Or we can use it to build something better, to prove that peace isn't weakness, that the Brotherhood Compact wasn't some fantasy. It was real and it was murdered, and now we have the proof to bring it back to life. Sledge studied her from across the room. And what happens to the guilty? What happens to Rattler? What happens to the men in my own club who took money from Finch to keep the war machine running? Rattler faces the law, real law. Federal prosecutors RICO charges everything in these documents handed over to people whose job it is to sort justice from vengeance. Piper held the sealed envelope in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the finality of it, the knowledge that whatever was written inside had been waiting 12 years for this exact moment. The rest is up to each club, each person. You can't force people to forgive. You can only give them the truth and the choice. Merle stepped forward. Sidewinders support the peace, all of it, the real thing this time. Not some handshake in a photograph, but a working alliance. Territory agreements, shared trade routes, coordinated charity runs. Everything Tommy and Emmett were trying to build before it was taken from them. Scarlett spoke from beside Silas. Darlene Nolan, she said, offering her real name to the room with the deliberate significance of someone removing a mask they had worn for too long. I'd like to shake hands with my enemy and call him brother. Dust devils stand with the compact. The room turned to Sledge. 70 people, 3 clubs, 20 years of manufactured hatred, all balanced on the decision of a man the size of a small building who stood by the window with his arms at his sides and his face unreadable in the lamplight. He was quiet for a long time. The kind of long time that makes seconds feel like they have been stretched on a rack until they confess to being minutes. He looked at his riders through the window, looked at the Sidewinders and Dust Devils who waited below with the uncertain posture of people who had been enemies for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand beside someone without calculating the angle of attack. Garrett Finch died 4 years ago, Sledge said finally. Heart attack. Dropped dead in his garage while changing the oil on his bike. I stood at his funeral and called him the greatest leader the Stone Kings ever had. He paused and the muscles in his jaw worked against something that might have been grief or rage or the particular shame of a man discovering that he had been mourning a traitor. I named my son after him. The admission hung in the air, and Piper understood that this was not a statement of resistance. It was the sound of a man breaking through the last wall between himself and a truth he had been avoiding. The personal cost of accepting what these documents proved. Not just the political implications, not just the strategic recalculations, but the intimate devastation of learning that someone you loved and trusted had sold your people's blood for territory. Sledge extended one massive hand toward Merle Briggs, then toward Silas, who pushed himself off the doorframe to meet the gesture despite the cost to his wounded body. Then toward Scarlett, who took his hand with a grip that communicated everything words could not. Stone Kings honor their debts, Sledge said, to Emmett Calloway, to his granddaughter, and to the peace she's buying with more courage than most men I've known could summon in a lifetime. Piper felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the sensation of a door opening onto a room she had been told did not exist, only to discover that it had been there all along, waiting for someone to turn the handle. She broke the wax seal on her grandfather's letter. The paper inside was a single sheet written on both sides in the same block handwriting that labeled the cassette tapes and filled the margins of the meeting transcripts. The ink was faded but legible, and Piper read it silently, first letting the words settle into her understanding before she spoke them aloud. When she looked up, every eye in the room was on her, waiting with the particular attention that human beings reserve for moments they understand are going to change the shape of their memories. He wrote this the day he went into hiding, Piper said. The day he left his club, his friends, and everything he had built to protect a secret he believed would matter someday. She began to read. To my heir. I am writing this letter knowing I will never send it. Knowing that by the time you read these words I will be gone, and the world I left behind will have continued its bleeding without me. I am writing because I owe you an explanation, though. No explanation can justify the weight I am placing on shoulders I have never seen. Piper's voice steadied as she read, drawing strength from the words themselves, from the rhythm of her grandfather's thoughts, committed to paper in a moment of absolute clarity. I have done violent things in my life. I have broken bones and broken promises and broken the hearts of people who deserve better from me. I rode with men and women who lived by codes that the world outside our circle would call criminal, and I will not pretend that those codes were always just. But within that imperfect world, I found something worth protecting, a belief that the people of the desert could be more than what their worst instincts demanded. That peace was possible not as an absence of conflict, but as a choice made daily by people strong enough to choose it. She paused, and in the silence she heard Silas's breathing, Merle's boots shifting on the wooden floor, the distant sound of engines cooling in the street below. I know I have no right to ask this of you, no right to reach forward. Across years I will not live to see him place a burden on someone who did not choose it. Your mother will be angry with me, and she will be right. She wanted you to grow up free of the dust and the blood and the endless mathematics of who owes what to whom. She wanted you to have the life I could not give her. Piper felt tears building behind her eyes, but did not let them fall. Not yet. Not until the words were finished. But I have watched you, little one. In the years I had left, I watched you grow, and what I saw gave me something I had lost. Hope. Not because you are strong, though you are. Not because you are brave, though I believe you will be. But because you ask why. You are the first person in 3 generations of Callaways who looks at the world and asks why before asking how. And that single question, why, is the only weapon that has ever defeated the kind of hatred that has poisoned these deserts. She turned the page over. In the box you will find everything I gathered. Proof of what was done and who did it and why. Use it however your conscience directs. If you choose vengeance, I will not judge you from wherever I am. If you choose forgiveness, I will not call you weak. But know this, the Brotherhood Compact was not my dream alone. It belonged to every rider who ever looked across the desert at an enemy and saw a human being instead of a target. It belonged to Tommy Slade, who died believing in it. It belonged to Lorraine Bassett, who lost her son to the war it could have prevented. It belongs to you now, and to whoever stands beside you when you read these words. Piper lowered the letter and spoke the final line from memory, because she had already read it twice silently and knew it would be the sentence she carried for the rest of her life. True strength comes not from the symbols we inherit, but from the courage we choose to claim. The room was silent for 10 full seconds, an eternity measured in heartbeats, inhaled breath, and the quiet recalibration of 70 lives that had just been permanently altered by the words of a dead man who had loved a granddaughter he barely knew well enough to trust her with everything. Sledge Bodine spoke first. Emmett Calloway. He shook his massive head slowly, and the motion carried something that transcended admiration. Crazy enough to believe that a letter and a box of tapes could end a war, and somehow crazy enough to be right. Merle pulled a phone from his pocket. I know a federal prosecutor in Reno, former military, handles RICO cases and club-related crime. If we hand him these tapes and documents tonight, Rattler's in custody by morning. Silas nodded weakly from the doorway. The Brotherhood Compact wasn't about forgetting the past. Emmett always said that. It was about choosing the future, agreeing to build something that the next generation wouldn't have to bleed for. Piper looked at each of them in turn. Merle, whose cousin had been murdered by the man he had followed for 20 years. Sledge, whose predecessor had sold his club's loyalty for territorial gain. Silas, who had ridden hundreds of miles with bullets in his body to honor a promise made to a friend who could no longer honor it himself. Scarlet, whose scar told the story of a war that had never needed to happen. Harlan, who had kept a box of truth locked in a safe for 12 years because a man he respected had asked him to. My grandfather didn't do this alone, Piper said, and I can't finish it alone either. This isn't about one person or one club or one bloodline. It's about whether we're willing to be better than the worst things that happened to us. The work that followed was not dramatic. It did not involve gunfire or confrontation or the kind of theatrical moments that make for good stories told around campfires. It was quiet, meticulous, and collaborative in ways that would have seemed impossible an hour ago. Merle made his phone call. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Carol, who spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to being awakened at odd hours with information that could not wait until morning, listened to a summary of the evidence, and dispatched agents from the Reno field office before the call was over. Harlan made copies of every document using the ancient photocopier in his shop, producing duplicates that were distributed among all three clubs so that no single person or organization held exclusive control of the truth. The cassette tapes were played in their entirety, each one adding another layer to the picture of systematic betrayal that Emmett Calloway had spent years constructing. Scarlett tended to the wounded from all three clubs with equal attention, her medical training proving as valuable in the aftermath of revelation as it had been in the aftermath of violence. She stitched a gash on a Stone King's forearm with the same steady hands that had packed Silas's bullet wounds, and the act itself, a dust devil healing a Stone King, communicated something that no speech or handshake could match. Sledge sent two of his riders to retrieve Rattler from the street below. Vernon Slade arrived in Harlan's apartment bound and diminished, his earlier menace dissolved into the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man whose lies had finally run out of road. He did not speak as the evidence was laid out before him, did not deny or deflect or attempt the kind of rhetorical maneuvering that had sustained his authority for 2 decades. He simply sat in a wooden chair in the corner of the room, his bound hands resting in his lap, staring at the floor with the fixed gaze of someone watching the architecture of their entire life collapse inward. When the federal agents arrived 90 minutes later, Vernon Slade went quietly. The agents processed the evidence with professional efficiency, taking statements from Merle Silas Scarlett and Piper herself, whose testimony delivered with the steady clarity of a child who had been asked to describe the worst night of her life, would form the backbone of the case that prosecutors would build over the following months. Piper watched them lead Rattler to the waiting vehicle, his shaved head bowed, his tattooed skin looking somehow less menacing under the harsh fluorescent glare of the agent's portable lights. He was not a monster. He was a man who had chosen power over everything else the world had to offer, and the cost of that choice was finally being presented in terms he could not negotiate or escape. Dawn arrived while they were still sorting through documents. The Nevada sky turned from black to deep purple to the particular shade of orange that only desert sunrises produce, a color so vivid and complete that it seemed like the earth itself was being forged anew in a furnace that burned beyond the horizon. The light crept down Main Street, touching the chrome of 70 motorcycles that sat side by side in a formation that had never existed before and that would be talked about in the desert for decades to come. Piper stood on the steps of Harlan's shop and watched the sun rise over Redstone Gap. She was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, her body running on nothing but the residual electricity of a night that had demanded everything she had and then demanded more. Silas's blood had dried to rust-colored stains on her hands and the front of her jacket. The brass key hung from a chain around her neck. Its purpose fulfilled its weight, transformed from burden to keepsake. Sledge appeared beside her, his massive frame blocking enough sunlight to cast a shadow that covered half the porch. He did not say anything for a long time. They simply stood together, an unlikely pair silhouetted against the desert dawn, watching the first true morning of a peace that had been 20 years in the making. "Your grandfather would be proud," Sledge said finally. "He'd be tired," Piper replied, and the big man's laugh was the first genuine laughter Redstone Gap had heard in longer than anyone could remember. 6 months later, Piper Calloway stood in the parking lot of Redstone Gap Elementary, watching her classmates pile onto buses with the familiar chaos of the last day of school. She had grown 3 inches since that night on Main Street, and the jacket fit differently now. Less costume and more uniform, the sleeves requiring only a single roll instead of the bulky donuts that had earned her so much ridicule in another lifetime. The patch between her shoulder blades still drew stares from teachers and students, but the quality of those stares had changed. There was curiosity now where there had been contempt, respect where there had been fear, and occasionally from the older residents of Redstone Gap, who had been awakened by 70 motorcycles on a night they would never forget something that looked like understanding. Piper. Tommy Hernandez waved from the steps of Bus 7, a folded paper in his hand. You sure you don't want to come to my pool party? My mom said she'd make those tamales you like. She smiled and shook her head. Thanks, but I've got plans. The plans involved the third Saturday of every month, which had become the most unlikely tradition in Nevada desert history. At 2 in the afternoon, representatives from 3 motorcycle clubs would gather in the back room of Harlon Puit's repair shop to discuss territory agreements, coordinate charity runs that benefited the Children's Hospital in Las Vegas, and work through the endless, tedious, unglamorous complexity of keeping peace between organizations that had been built for war. Piper had missed exactly 1 meeting in 6 months. Laid up with pneumonia, she had insisted on participating by phone, her voice raspy and thin, through the speaker, while men and women 3 times her age waited for her input before making decisions that affected hundreds of lives across the Southwest. She walked the familiar route to Main Street, passing the hardware store and the laundromat and the storefronts that were no longer entirely empty. The Dust Devils had established a clubhouse in the old Greyhound station, converting it into a motorcycle repair shop and community center that served both functions with the practical efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on being useful. Through the bay window, Piper could see Scarlett teaching a group of local teenagers basic engine maintenance, her scar catching the afternoon light, her patience with fumbling hands and dropped wrenches, a testament to the particular gentleness that sometimes lives beneath the hardest surfaces. Silas had recovered fully from his wounds over 3 months of physical therapy that he approached with the same stubborn determination he brought to everything else. He now served as the club's official liaison to the Redstone Gap Town Council, a role that would have been inconceivable a year ago and was now so ordinary that the council members had started bringing him coffee at meetings without being asked. The Sidewinders' transformation had been the most dramatic. Rattler's removal from leadership had been swift and unanimous, accomplished through a vote that took less than 3 minutes, and carried the particular finality of a door being closed on a room that nobody wanted to enter again. Vernon Slade had pleaded guilty to federal racketeering charges and received 5 years of probation in exchange for his full cooperation with prosecutors. The deal had not satisfied everyone. Merle Briggs had argued for prison time. Sledge had suggested more creative alternatives that the federal agents politely declined to consider. But Justice Piper had learned was messy and incomplete, and nothing like the clean resolutions that stories promised. It was a process, not a destination, and the journey toward it was measured in compromises that left everyone slightly dissatisfied and therefore roughly equal. Vernon Slade now worked at Harlon Puit's repair shop, stocking shelves and sorting hardware, with the quiet concentration of a man who had been given the opportunity to perform simple, honest labor and recognized it for the gift it was. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not make eye contact with the riders who came through the shop on meeting days. He simply existed in the space between punishment and redemption, doing the work that was in front of him, carrying the weight of what he had done with a silence that said more about his understanding of it than any confession could. Merle had stepped into the Sidewinders' presidency with a combination of authority and humility that reminded Piper of the stories Crow had told about the original Brotherhood compact. He rode into Redstone Gap every third Saturday with a discipline that honored the position and a warmth that honored the man he had become since learning the truth about his cousin's death. As Piper approached Harlan's shop, she saw the familiar collection of motorcycles parked outside. Dust Devils, Sidewinders, and Stone Kings side by side, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun, with the particular brightness of machines that were loved and maintained by people who understood that the things you care for reflect the person you are choosing to be. The sight still gave her a small thrill, not of pride, something quieter. The satisfaction of seeing a blueprint become a building, of watching an idea survive its collision with reality and emerge battered but functional on the other side. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and conversation paused while everyone acknowledged her arrival. Sledge's nephew, a lanky 19-year-old named Jesse, who had recently begun prospecting for the Stone Kings, stood near the back of the room with the carefully neutral expression of someone trying very hard to appear unimpressed by everything around him. Piper recognized the look. She had worn it herself not so long ago. "Piper." Harlan's voice came from behind the counter, where he was organizing a display of spark plugs with the same meticulous attention he had once applied to bank ledgers. "Your grandfather's things came back from the county courthouse. Thought you might want to take them home today." The box was small cardboard sealed with evidence tape that had been cut and resealed with a sticker indicating its release from federal custody. Inside lay the last of Emmett Calloway's personal effects, items that had been held during the investigation into Vernon Slade's activities and the broader conspiracy that the documents from Box 247 had exposed. Piper opened the box at the counter while the meeting assembled behind her. Military service medals from a war fought before she was born, a pocket knife with a worn handle, and photographs she had never seen preserved in the same acid-free sleeves that had protected the evidence. The first photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes standing in front of a motorcycle with her hands on her hips and her head tilted at an angle that suggested she had just said something that made the photographer smile. Piper turned it over. "Charlotte, my heart, 1985. Her grandmother, a woman Piper had never met who had died before Piper was born, whose existence had been reduced to a single line in conversations her mother refused to have. But here she was, young and alive, and full of the kind of energy that photographs can capture, but never fully contain, frozen in a moment when the future was still a promise rather than a debt. Piper placed the photograph carefully in the breast pocket of the jacket close to her heart where it would rest against the leather that had traveled through decades and wars and a 12-year-old girl's terrifying journey toward understanding. The meeting began around her voices discussing logistics and schedules and the mundane machinery of maintained peace. Piper took her usual seat at the end of the table, her notebook open, her pen ready, listening with the particular attention of someone who understood that the most important moments in history are not the dramatic ones. They are the ones where people who used to hate each other sit in the same room and talk about charity, runs, and territory boundaries, and who is bringing coffee next month. Bryce Lowell had found her in the hallway at school 3 weeks after the night on Main Street. He had not apologized with words. He had simply stood in front of her with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor and said, "I didn't know." Piper had nodded. There was nothing else required. Understanding was its own form of closure, and she had learned enough about the cost of holding grudges to know that letting them go was not weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength. After the meeting, when the motorcycles had departed and Main Street had settled back into its usual quiet, Piper walked home through streets that looked the same as they always had, but felt fundamentally different. The same cracked asphalt, the same stubborn weeds, the same desert heat pressing down on a town that had never been more than a footnote in Nevada's history. But the undercurrent of tension that had hummed beneath everything for as long as Piper could remember, the sense that violence was always one wrong word away, had been replaced by something ordinary. The simple friction of a small town learning to live with its own complicated past. She found Jolene in the kitchen, and for the first time in Piper's memory, her mother was not hunched over bills. She was standing at the counter chopping vegetables with the focused attention of someone preparing a meal that mattered, and on the wall behind her, in a frame that Piper had never seen before, hung a photograph of Emmett Calloway. Not the young man in the leather jacket, not the legend or the lieutenant or the ghost that had haunted their family for 20 years. Just an old man sitting on the steps of their trailer, squinting into the desert sun, with a small girl on his lap who was reaching for the silver patch on his jacket with chubby, curious fingers. "Harlan gave me that," Jolene said without turning around. "Said Emmett asked him to hold it. Said it was his favorite picture of the two of you." Piper stood in the doorway looking at the photograph, at the proof that she had been part of this story from the very beginning, that her grandfather had held her in his arms and known, with the certainty of a man who had survived enough to recognize strength in its earliest forms, that she would be the one to carry his truth into a world that was ready to hear it. "I found a picture of Grandma Charlotte," Piper said, "in his things." Jolene's chopping paused. Her shoulders did not tighten the way they always had when the past was mentioned. Instead, they seemed to settle as though a weight she had been carrying for years had quietly put itself down when she was not paying attention. "She was beautiful," Jolene said softly, and stubborn and completely impossible to argue with. A pause. You get that from her? Piper smiled. She crossed the kitchen and placed the photograph of Charlotte beside the one of Emmett on the wall. Two faces from a past that had finally stopped being something to fear and had become instead something to honor. That evening, she took her place on the flat rock behind the trailer, the same spot where she had sat for years watching cars disappear down the highway toward lives she could not imagine. The jacket settled around her shoulders with the familiar weight that had become as natural as her own skin, the patch warm against her back, the brass key hanging from its chain beneath her collar. But she was not watching the cars tonight. She was watching the desert, the vast sweep of sand and stone and stubborn life that stretched to the horizon in every direction, and she was thinking about what it meant to inherit something. Not just a jacket or a key or a box of documents, but a belief. A conviction that the world could be better than its worst moments, that people could choose peace over hatred if someone was brave enough to show them the proof. In the distance, the sound of motorcycles reached her ears. Three different engine signatures approaching from three different directions converging on Redstone Gap, for reasons that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the simple revolutionary act of keeping a promise. Piper Calloway stood up from the rock, brushed the dust from her grandfather's jacket, and walked toward the sound. The little girl who had been mocked for inheriting a useless jacket was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had learned the hardest lesson the desert had to teach, that the weight we carry is not a punishment, it is a choice, and the courage to bear it is the only inheritance that truly matters.